Inmate in Missouri has become the first openly transgender woman to be executed in the United States. 49-year-old Amber Mclaughlin died by injection on Tuesday for stabbing her former girlfriend to death in 2003. Governor Mike Parson denied a last-minute clemency request before her execution.
January 3rd, 2023. The prison walls in Missouri stood cold and silent as the morning sun rose. Behind one of those walls, inside cell 47, history waited to happen. Amber Mclaughlin lay awake, staring at the thin stream of light cutting through her window. For her, this sunrise was not the beginning of a new day. It was the countdown to the end. In just 12 hours, she would be strapped to a gurney, a needle pushed into her arm, and her name would be written into the darkest pages of American history. Nearly 7,000 mornings had come and gone since she was locked inside, but this one carried a cruel truth. There would never be another. Amber was about to become the first openly transgender person executed in the United States. But here's what most people never stop to ask. Who was she before this? What broken childhood created the person sitting on death row? What choices, what failures of the system, what wounds left to rot led to this moment? And then comes the question that splits people in half. Can someone who has done something unforgivable truly change? Or are some lives beyond redemption? Before she became Amber, she was born Scott Mclaughlin on January 13, 1973. From the very beginning, life dealt her blows most children never survive. Her biological parents were consumed by chaos. Her mother was involved in sex work, her father struggled with alcoholism, and violence bled into daily life. Scott was removed from their care before he was old enough to form clear memories. Foster care should have been an escape. Instead, it brought new nightmares. In one home, when he was barely learning to walk, a foster parent punished him by rubbing feces in his face. It was not discipline. It was cruelty meant to humiliate a child too small to even understand why. At age 5, Scott was adopted with his siblings. Hope should have lived there. His new father wore a police badge, a man sworn to protect and serve. But behind closed doors, that uniform was a mask. The very symbol of safety became the symbol of fear. Scott's adoptive father beat the children with paddles and with his police nightstick. He used a taser on them, the same weapon meant for criminals, turned against small and helpless children. Food became another weapon. Cabinets and refrigerators were locked. Hunger was deliberate, another method of control. The children and their friends called the place the House of Horrors. It wasn't exaggeration. It was the only way they could explain the torture that happened day after day. By 9 years old, the damage was visible not just on Scott's body, but inside his mind. School testing showed his IQ at 82, bordering on intellectual disability. Doctors diagnosed ADHD, neurological impairment, depression, and what they called adjustment reaction of childhood. In plain words, his brain had been rewired by trauma. Constant abuse teaches survival, not stability. It leaves a child impulsive, anxious, broken in places that never fully heal. Teachers noticed. They filed reports. They raised alarms about bruises, hunger, and neglect. But the system failed him. Time and again, the people and institutions meant to protect him turned their heads. By 12, Scott had attempted suicide, more than once. The weight of pain was too heavy for a child to carry. Alone, in secret, he also began dressing in women's clothing, glimpses of a truth he could not safely reveal in a house where violence ruled. This is the root of the controversy. Some see a child brutalized beyond repair, a victim of endless cruelty. Others see the beginnings of a future predator, someone shaped by trauma into danger. The truth may be that both exist together. The system failed Scott, and by failing him, it failed Beverly Genther too. But trauma alone does not excuse murder. So the question remains, how did a broken child become a killer? While Scott Mclaughlin carried his scars into adulthood, Beverly Genther was trying to build something new from the ashes of her past. At 45, she had already endured storms that would have broken many others. A difficult marriage had left her drained, her divorce a painful reminder of years spent in unhappiness. But by 2003, Beverly was stepping into a chapter that felt like hers alone. She had her own car, her own house, and, most importantly, her independence. For the first time in years, she wasn't living in the shadow of someone else's choices. She was choosing for herself, and her family noticed the difference. Her younger brother, Al Wedipole, remembered those months as her rebirth. It was Beverly's time of renewal, he would later say. After years of depression, she was finally smiling again, finally hopeful. Beverly worked in an office in Earth City, Missouri, a job that gave her structure and pride. Colleagues described her as reliable, steady, kind. She was not flashy or reckless. She was the sort of woman who built her happiness slowly, carefully, as if she knew how fragile it could be. Her life was simple, but it was hers. And then she met Scott Mclaughlin. At first, there was nothing alarming about him. Like many abusers, Scott wore a mask well. To Beverly, he seemed interested, attentive, maybe even safe. For a woman who had fought her way back to independence, companionship might have seemed like the next step. What she couldn't know was that she was stepping into a trap disguised as affection. The relationship soured quickly. Scott was manipulative, controlling, and at times violent. Beverly felt the shift but struggled with what to do. Love, or the shadow of what looked like love, can confuse even the strongest people. She pulled away, regained her strength, and in September 2003, she ended the relationship. That should have been the end. But with Scott, no was not an answer. Al met Scott once at a family gathering and saw through the mask immediately. His sister had brought Scott into their circle, but Scott walked past Al and his wife without acknowledgement, without basic courtesy. The arrogance was striking, and Al didn't forget it. Later, after the murder, he would describe his sister's decision to date Scott as the worst mistake she ever made. After the breakup, Beverly wanted distance. Scott wanted control. What followed was a textbook case of stalking, the kind women across America face every day, and the kind that too often ends in violence. Scott lurked in her workplace, sometimes sneaking inside the building to watch her. He called her again and again, refusing to let her move on. He followed her home. He monitored her like she was property, not a person. On October 27th, the obsession escalated into a crime. Scott broke into Beverly's home. He stole clothing, electronics, personal items, even toiletries. Beverly was shaken, terrified. She took the step so many women are forced to take. She obtained a protective order. It was a piece of paper meant to keep her safe. The hearing for a full restraining order was set for November 21st, 2003. But Beverly would never see that day. On November 20th, Scott's rage spilled into words that no one took seriously enough. To a friend, he confessed his intention. "I'm fin killing that BH." It wasn't an idle threat. It wasn't just anger. It was a promise. Hours later, Beverly left her office at 6 p.m. She walked to her truck, unaware that her stalker, her abuser, her would-be killer was already moving toward her. She never made it home. November 20th, 2003. The day that should have been ordinary, but instead became the last chapter of Beverly Genther's life. She finished her shift at the Earth City office around 6 p.m. The November air was cool, the kind of night that promises nothing unusual. She gathered her things, locked up, and walked toward her truck. It was a simple routine, one she had followed countless times. But this time, danger was waiting. When neighbors later noticed Beverly never made it home, worry began to spread. Police found her truck abandoned in the parking lot of her workplace. The scene was chilling in its silence. On the ground nearby lay a broken knife handle. A trail of blood stretched from the vehicle into the darkness. Something terrible had happened. and Beverly was gone. It did not take long for suspicion to fall on Scott Mclaughlin. Hours after Beverly vanished, Scott was seen at her brother's home around 7:30 p.m., covered in blood. She washed herself, changed clothes, and disappeared again into the night. Later, around midnight, she called another acquaintance, asking for help with what she claimed was a flat tire. The friend refused, unknowingly turning down a role in covering up a murder. By the following morning, Scott appeared at a nephew's house around 7 a.m., scratched, filthy, disheveled. She convinced a friend to drive her to Walmart, where she bought bleach. To those around her, the excuse was innocent. She said her car smelled of mildew. In reality, she was trying to scrub away the evidence of what she had done. But evidence leaves traces that bleach cannot hide. That evening, police arrested Scott at a hospital. Under pressure, she eventually led authorities to the body. Beverly's body was found dumped along the banks of the Mississippi River, not far from Scott's brother's home in St. Louis. What investigators uncovered there revealed the cruelty of her final moments. Her dress and bra were pushed up to her neck. Her underwear was gone, her feet were bound together. She bore the marks of a brutal beating, her face swollen and cut. She had been restrained by her wrists, sexually assaulted, and stabbed with a steak knife. 7 stab wounds scarred her body. 4 were defensive, proof that Beverly fought with every ounce of strength she had. She clawed, resisted, struggled to survive. But the knife found her neck, severing her carotid artery. The wound was fatal. Even death did not end the violence. The autopsy revealed injuries inflicted after she had already passed. Rage and depravity continued, turning her murder into something even darker, an act not just of killing, but of domination and hatred. Back at the crime scene, investigators found Beverly's blood throughout Scott's car. Despite attempts to rip out upholstery and douse everything in bleach, the truth remained. DNA evidence from a rape kit tied Scott directly to the assault. The reality was undeniable. Beverly had been stalked, terrorized, abducted, raped, and murdered by the person who once claimed to love her. This is the part that haunts. Beverly had fought back. She resisted until her final breath. She tried to survive, but one woman's strength was no match for a predator's obsession. By 2006, 3 years had passed since Beverly Genther's murder. The evidence against Scott Mclaughlin was overwhelming. Blood in the car, DNA in the rape kit, witnesses who saw her bloodied and frantic, the bleach, the lies, the confession. The jury had no difficulty convicting her of first-degree murder, forcible rape, and armed criminal action. But in the American justice system, conviction is only half the story. The other half is punishment. And here, in a twist so maddening that it still sparks debate nearly 2 decades later, Scott's fate took a path that would have been impossible in most other states. The prosecution argued for death. They pointed to aggravating factors: the rape, the stalking, the cruelty. The defense countered with promises to present Scott's traumatic childhood, her intellectual limitations, the brain damage from fetal alcohol exposure, her documented history of depression and suicide attempts. They wanted the jury to see not just the crime, but the broken child who had grown into the adult sitting in that courtroom. But then came the collapse. The defense's mental health expert, the very person tasked with explaining decades of abuse and damage, was forced to withdraw. Why? Because it came to light that he had falsified data in other cases. Overnight, the defense's most important witness was gone. The jury never heard the full picture of Scott's mental illness, her trauma, or her neurological damage. They only saw the monster painted by the prosecution. The jury had no problem convicting. But when it came time to decide punishment, something extraordinary happened. They deadlocked on the death penalty, split. They could not agree that Scott deserved to die. In 48 out of the 50 states that allow capital punishment, that would have been the end of it. A deadlocked jury means the defendant lives, sentenced instead to life without parole. The reasoning is simple. If 12 citizens cannot unanimously agree to execute, the state should not kill. Period. But Missouri is not like most states. Missouri and only one other state, Indiana, have a loophole. When the jury cannot decide, the power shifts to a single man, the trial judge. Judge Stephen Goldman took the bench. With a stroke of his pen, he overruled 12 citizens who had sat through the entire trial. He imposed death, just like that. Think about it. 12 people listened to weeks of testimony, examined the evidence, agonized over the decision, and they could not all agree that Scott deserved death. Yet one man, wearing robes, decided he knew better. In Missouri, democracy stopped at the courtroom door. It gets worse. Judge Goldman justified his ruling by leaning on aggravating circumstances the jury had already rejected. In other words, he used the very arguments 12 citizens had already dismissed to impose the most final punishment possible: death by judicial override. Years later, 7 former Missouri judges, including a former Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, wrote openly about their outrage. They said Scott had been deprived of her right to a jury sentence. They pointed out that even without hearing the missing mental health evidence, the jury had refused to recommend death. What kind of justice is it, they asked, when one man can silence 12? The appeals dragged on. In 2016, a federal district court agreed that Scott's defense had been a disaster. The judge ruled that the failure to present mental health testimony was so grievous, so damaging, that it violated her constitutional rights. He vacated the death sentence. For a moment, it seemed the injustice might be undone. But in 2021, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit crushed that hope. They reinstated the death penalty, arguing that even if the jury had heard about Scott's brain damage, her childhood trauma, her IQ of 82, it probably wouldn't have changed the outcome. Probably. That single word carried the weight of life and death. This is the part that should make you furious. In nearly every other state, Scott Mclaughlin would have been alive, serving life without parole. In Missouri, she was marked for execution because of a loophole and a judge's ego. So the question becomes, what happens when a single man in a black robe can overrule 12 ordinary citizens on the matter of life and death? Is that justice, or is that tyranny hidden inside the courtroom? After the gavel came down and the sentence was sealed, Scott Mclaughlin was led away to death row. The cold corridors of the Potosi Correctional Center would become home for nearly 2 decades. For most condemned prisoners, the years blur together, waiting, appealing, wasting away. But for Scott, those years became something else entirely. Behind those walls, Scott began to unravel the truth he had been hiding since childhood. The scared boy who had once tried on women's clothes in secret, terrified of discovery in a house of beatings and tasers, finally found the space, ironically inside prison, to acknowledge who he really was. Out of sight from the world, Scott began to transition. She chose the name Amber. Her journey wasn't simple. Until 2018, Missouri's Department of Corrections had a blanket ban on providing hormone therapy to inmates unless they had already been on it before incarceration. That meant Amber, who had suppressed her identity all her life, was trapped in limbo. Then came Jessica Hicklin. Another transgender inmate, Hicklin spent 26 years in prison for a drug-related killing. She sued the Missouri prison system, arguing that denying hormone therapy to trans inmates was unconstitutional. In 2018, she won. That victory cracked open the door for others, including Amber. Hicklin became more than a legal trailblazer. She became Amber's mentor, her anchor. From one prison to another, they built a friendship through letters, bound by shared scars. Mclaughlin once said, "Amber could really use a mother right now." And that is what she became. A mother figure who guided Amber through one of the most vulnerable transformations any person can undertake. As Amber transitioned, those around her noticed something astonishing. Gone was the withdrawn, broken figure marked only by violence and crime. In her place emerged someone almost childlike in innocence. Fellow inmates and even prison staff remarked on the change. She became known for her kindness, her easy smile, and her terrible dad jokes. Yes, dad jokes. The same person who had once stalked and murdered was now the one brightening gray days on death row with corny one-liners. One fellow inmate described how she always had a joke ready, not because she thought prison was funny, but because she wanted others to smile, if only for a second. Her letters read with the simplicity of someone frozen in adolescence, forever stunted by trauma, yet finally daring to be herself. "I think if I'd been my true self, I probably would not have been there," Amber reflected in one interview. Those words, haunting and tragic, carried the weight of decades of silence. They suggested that authenticity might have saved her long before the crime ever happened. Her friend and fellow transgender inmate, Patricia Elaine Trimble, described Amber's change as remarkable. Trimble said Amber found peace living openly as herself. In their last conversations, Amber confessed she wished she could have come out many years earlier. Her attorney, too, saw the transformation. He called it an act of courage, because living openly as a transgender woman on death row was not safe. It meant ridicule, harassment, and violence from other inmates, and sometimes even from staff. Yet Amber chose truth over comfort. She chose authenticity over survival. This is the part of the story that tears people apart. On one side, you see a murderer, guilty of stalking, rape, and brutal killing. On the other side, you see a person who finally discovered kindness, who tried to heal and even help others, even when she knew death was inevitable. Which truth do we believe? Do we allow transformation to matter? Or is it nothing more than window dressing on an unforgivable crime? Because here lies the brutal tension. Beverly Gwenther never got a second chance. She never got to discover a new chapter or transform or grow old. Amber did, inside the very walls built to punish her. So the question remains, and it will follow us into the next chapter. Could transformation ever erase the horror of Beverly's murder? As January 3, 2023 drew near, Amber Mclaughlin's lawyers scrambled for one final chance at mercy. They prepared a 27-page clemency petition, a document that laid bare every hidden corner of her life. Page after page detailed the abuse, the foster homes, the adoptive father's taser and locked refrigerator, the suicide attempts, the brain damage, the IQ of 82. It was not a legal brief as much as it was a cry. Look at the child before you judge the adult. But the petition did not stand alone. It carried voices of power and authority. 7 former Missouri judges, including a former Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, signed their names in outrage. They pointed out what the trial jury had already shown. They did not unanimously choose death. In their words, no judge should ever have the authority to silence 12 jurors. 2 members of Congress added their pleas. Cori Bush and Emanuel Cleaver, both ordained ministers, wrote to the governor, their letter drenched in both faith and politics. "We believe in accountability," they said, "but also the sanctity of life. And we do not think those two values are mutually exclusive. In other words, you can punish without killing. You can hold someone responsible without becoming their executioner." But Governor Mike Parson saw it differently. Hours before the execution, his office released the decision. Amber's sentence would stand. His statement was blunt. Mclaughlin stalked, raped, and murdered Ms. Gwenther. Mclaughlin is a violent criminal. Ms. Gwenther's family and loved ones deserve peace. The state of Missouri will carry out Mclaughlin's sentence according to the court's order and deliver justice. It was a statement of finality, but also of controversy. For some, Parsons' words represented strength, a state standing firm for victims. For others, it was proof of cruelty, a refusal to see the broken child behind the crime. And so Amber faced her last day. She spent the hours in prayer with her spiritual advisor, Lauren Bennett, a pastor who had become more than just religious counsel. Bennett was friend, confidant, and witness to Amber's late transformation. Their conversations circled around forgiveness, seeking it and offering it. In quiet moments, Amber wrote letters to those who had supported her, words of thanks to the people who had seen her not as a killer, but as a human being. She apologized, again and again. To reporters, she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen." To friends in letters, she admitted shame but also gratitude. And in her final written statement, prepared for the moment her life would end, she left the world with just 2 sentences. "I am sorry for what I did. I am a loving and caring person." For some, those words rang hollow. How could someone guilty of such a brutal murder call themselves loving? For others, those words revealed the tragedy of her existence, that only in death row's shadows did she find the courage to speak the truth of who she thought she was. And here lies the torment of this story. Amber's truth came too late. Too late for Beverly, too late for her family, too late for the justice system. But history, with its long and complicated memory, would not forget her. January 3rd, 2023. The hour had finally arrived. At 6:39 p.m., inside the sterile white walls of the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri, Amber Mclaughlin was strapped to a gurney, the straps stretched across her body, holding her still beneath a thin sheet. Through a glass window, witnesses looked in. Lawyers, reporters, family members, officials. Each one brought their own perspective. Some wanted justice, others wanted mercy, a few simply wanted to watch history unfold. Amber's spiritual advisor, Lauren Bennett, stood close, offering soft words and quiet hymns. It was the only comfort left as the state prepared to end her life. A 5-gram dose of pentobarbital was injected into her veins. Her breathing grew heavier, slower. Minutes later, her chest stilled. At 6:51 p.m., she was pronounced dead. In that moment, America crossed a line it had never crossed before. Amber Mclaughlin became the first openly transgender person executed in the history of the United States. She was also the first woman executed in Missouri since 1953, when Bonnie Hetty was put to death for the kidnapping and murder of a child. Since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976, out of more than 1,500 executions in the country, only 18 involved women. Now Amber's name joined that list. For Beverly Gwenther's family, the execution was a complicated form of closure. Her brother, Al Wedipole, had carried the weight of his sister's murder for nearly 20 years. Watching the person responsible finally pay the ultimate price offered him relief, but it was bittersweet. Nothing could bring Beverly back. No injection, no punishment, no death sentence could ever replace the life stolen from her. For the rest of the country, Amber's execution cracked open debates that stretched far beyond one crime. Was justice truly served, or was injustice multiplied? Some argued the case was simple. Amber stalked, raped, and murdered Beverly. The punishment fit the crime. Others saw layers of complexity, a childhood of abuse so severe it left her permanently damaged, a jury that could not agree on death, a single judge who imposed it anyway, and a person who found her true identity only while waiting to die. Trauma, identity, justice, transformation. All collided in this single case. Amber's death did not silence the questions. It amplified them. Should trauma and mental illness matter when deciding life or death? Should authenticity and transformation be weighed against the horror of murder? And should a system that allows one judge to overrule 12 citizens even exist? America had carried out its first execution of the year, but what it executed that night was not just a single person. It executed certainty. It executed the illusion that justice is ever simple. Beverly Genther deserved life. She deserved to grow older, to keep rebuilding her independence, to laugh with her brother Al, to live the quiet peace she had finally found. That was stolen from her in a flood of violence that no words can soften. Amber Mclaughlin deserved a childhood without torture. She deserved protection instead of foster homes where humiliation was punishment instead of an adoptive father whose badge masked a monster. She deserved safety instead of tasers, food instead of starvation, love instead of silence. That, too, was stolen from her before she ever had the chance to become who she truly was. Both truths can exist. Beverly is the innocent victim. Amber was once an innocent victim, too, before she became a perpetrator. And that contradiction, that collision of pain, identity, justice, and mercy, is what makes this story impossible to resolve neatly. This is not just about one murder. It is about what happens when cycles of trauma are ignored until they explode. It is about how a child's abuse echoes decades later into another family's tragedy. It is about a justice system that sometimes punishes not only for what someone did, but for what they were never allowed to become. So here is the question that will split this audience down the middle. Should trauma and identity matter in capital punishment? Or is murder so final, so absolute, that nothing can outweigh it? Drop your thoughts below, argue, defend, disagree. Because these questions are not just about Amber. They are about us, and the kind of justice we choose to carry forward. And if you've stayed this long, you already know. These are the stories no one else dares to tell. Stories that are messy, uncomfortable, and sometimes unbearable. If you believe they matter, then subscribe, because the next story might be the one that forces you to see justice, mercy, and humanity in a way you never expected.